Oops, start recording. All right, so baseline stuff. And then really today is going to be meant to get everything wrapped up, get us going or get us into a good place moving forward. And then if you have any additional questions, then today will be a good day to do some one-on-one stuff. All right. Any questions with the agenda? How about the table and chairs? How did that go this week? You guys are working on stuff.
It was a lot less dramatic.
Right? Yeah, it ends up being not as crazy, I think, as people think. I usually will see a lot of overthought getting, especially with this first assignment. But yeah, any hiccups or things that came about that you guys noticed while you're working with it? Yes. Yes. That happens. It really does. You're not the first or the last or probably the only one in here that did it. So it's that thing. It's hard for us to sometimes wrap our brain around, but these edge loops need to stay there. We want them there, right? Oftentimes it gets confusing when I say make sure your geometry is cleaned up, or particularly when we're going through. And there's sometimes edges that we do want to remove because they're just not really doing anything for us other than adding extra information that we don't need. But all of these edge loops that are here are contributing to the overall shape of this thing. That's why we can't remove them. So we're not going to go through, this is a confusing thing, right? Go through, I'll see students do this a lot. They'll grab all these edges and it's like, oh, well, they're not really doing anything, but they are, right? They're contributing to what's happening up here. So if we remove them, it looks clean, but really what have we done? We have a giant end gone now, right? Yeah. So it's tough to wrap the brain around a little bit at the beginning, but just keep in mind that yes, we want our edge loops. The only time we're really going to remove them, like for this instance, when we did the chair, we may have had some extra edge loops in here. I'm not even going to do that. We'll just do top level. Right, we might have had an edge loop here and an edge loop here.
From Quick Slice.
Yeah, from Quick Slice or whatever. Those we can remove because they aren't really contributing to the overall shape. Right, does that make sense? Yeah, cool. Okay.
I think the biggest problem that I had was figuring out how to put in those cuts for the holes in the chair when everything was trying to go in at an angle.
This?
Yeah.
Which part was going in at an angle?
Well, I mean, they're angled now, right above and below the holes, but like how to put them, I don't know how to describe what my problem was.
Okay.
It was frustrating.
Are you talking about this part?
Yeah.
Well, my suggestion would be is put the holes in here first and then move things around. That would be the route I would take with that. But really, I mean, it's I'm trying to think of a better way to really.
Well, I was following the video.
Yeah, and you can shift them over too. I think it's one of those things where I think you might be overthinking it just a little bit, but I mean, you're coming straight down here. As long as you have the points here, it doesn't really matter what angle these are. As long as your vertices are there, that's what you're attaching to. So.
Yeah, I went straighten those out because I thought that it should be.
Yeah, and you don't have to. I mean, you could, but you don't have to. Just remember, as long as the edge loops are in there, we got our quads, we got our tries. The viewer is never gonna see the edges. I mean, unless we were purposefully rendering out a wireframe view of something, but that's not really an applicable scenario for what you guys are going to be doing. Our viewer is only ever going to see that, right? So it's all an illusion. It's how can we make this stuff look like it needs to look by manipulating things behind the scenes. It's kind of like a magic act, right? So yeah, don't get too hung up on that. Eventually, as you get more practice, you're going to have to start thinking about, okay, how my edge flow is, particularly when you're dealing with characters. It becomes really important with characters that are deforming, and then edge flow will play a much bigger role than, say, it's doing for something like this, because we've got a rigid piece of geometry that's never going to bend. We're not animating it in any way like that, so we can get away with a little bit more. And even if we were going to animate this or bend or do something weird with it, the poly flow on this would be workable. Where it might be a little problematic is if, if we had something that was like, maybe, and I'm, say we had all this and we had something like, that might not be ideal. Could we get away with that right now? Maybe. Yes, we could from the animating perspective. It might cause us some weirdness for texturing. Maybe. But that would be not ideal. But we can get away with something like that. Right.
Is it possible to move those squares like to the right and left now that they're
Yeah.
placed?
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Just use the vertices. Grab your verts. Move them. That's it. Yeah. So we can adjust sizing, we can adjust placement, we can do whatever we want by just grabbing vertices. Remember, all modeling really is pushing and pulling points around at the very foundational level. That's really all we're doing. Okay. Any other questions on things that may have come up while you guys are working on this? I will tell you, as far as scale goes, and that's been a question that's come up a little bit, things that I will typically do with this. I have found that when I knock this down to meters, a single meter, and I knock my unit scale down to a meter, when I'm in the editing process, the clipping plane can get a little funky and the numbers can get really tiny and a little bit more challenging to work with. What I will usually do is I'll actually just work in my generic units, and then once I'm ready to bring stuff in, I'll make sure that it's scaled down properly. As long as you're working and you're making sure things are proportionate to one another, we can grab everything and just knock them down to the meter's scale. So that might be one route that you take. We can go into and adjust our clipping plane, view clipping, where we're adjusting our arrows to dictate when things will clip and when things won't clip. But that won't necessarily address the issue with our numbers having to be really tiny. And I personally find that really annoying to work with. So I for this one, for example, I just have it at the generic units. I have everything set to meters, but I haven't changed. I'll pull this up. Oops. What I haven't changed yet is this. And then I didn't go in, I haven't changed my grid yet to reflect it. But as soon as I do that, then I can just grab everything and scale it down, bring my biped in and scale it according to my biped. Right. But I usually save that to right towards the end when I'm getting ready to export it out to Unity. Some other things that we can do, we talked about last week. Brendan and I were actually talking about this a little bit the end of last class with the poly smooth or the poly preview. There are a couple ways that you can dodge around doing a quick poly preview rather than having to go up and add a turbo smooth off and on every time. You can hotkey it. There's two ways that you can do it. It's up to you in terms of what you choose. Either way, what we have to do is assign a hotkey to what our process is. So one method would be to select whatever piece of geometry that you've got, add a turbo smooth to it, and then if we go into our customize user interface, there's an option called show end result, and essentially what it does is it turns this off and on, and we can assign our own hotkey to it. That would be one route. Another route would be to utilize this use NURBS subdivision. It's a nice little preview option. Um, again, if we go into our assigning of hotkeys, I'm going to scroll down to find use NURBS right there. And over in the hotkey, I can assign something to it. My recommendation is assign something that already doesn't have something assigned to it, and it'll tell you if it already does. So for me, I assigned mine to a shift 2, and it's going to say, hey, that's not assigned to anything. So you can use it. Once you have that apply, go ahead and hit assign. Then we can save our hotkeys out. Save it. I would save this on your C drive somewhere, wherever Max is going to remain consistent, probably an install file. I'll just, for the sake of it, I'll just throw like maybe in documents or US Max. Okay, great. I'll save it in there. Save, close that out. And now every time I hit shift 2, it's going to give me a smooth preview. That doesn't seem to want to be shifting back. So that's one way we can dodge around it. That smooth preview option is just really nice, particularly when you're checking for modeling errors. In addition to having your show overlapping faces or show overlapping vertices, either one of those, if you have them on, it's going to help you out a ton. Because most of the emails or most of the issues that got pinged at me this week really ultimately came down to someone having this problem: overlapping vertices or overlapping faces. It's a very common issue to have. So if you can start utilizing some of the tools that will help you quickly identify those things, it'll make your life a little easier. Right. Common symptoms: tools don't work the way they're supposed to. When you do your smooth preview, things are reinforced in ways you don't want them to, or you're seeing a lot of extra subdivisions. But generally, tools will behave very strangely. That's a common symptom. So I recommend having one of these on at all times if you can. And again, I configure this so that it's a really low number, so it's not highlighting things that I meant to have close together. Sometimes if that number is too big, it'll start highlighting things that I know are okay. But when in doubt, go into your vert mode, select that area. If I want to know if I've got 2 vertices here, I'm going to select it. And in my statistics, it's going to tell me if I do. If this doesn't already give me information. Right. So just some helpful notes. Any other questions or things that you guys came up with that was problematic while modeling? No? Sweet.
I was trying to smooth the centerpiece.
Yeah, so for this, I will leave that up to you guys, because in order to really do that, if you're going to model this to smooth, you have to deal with the center pieces, right? Now, in my opinion, for something like this, it's not necessarily going to be a main focal point, and will it be worth the extra geometry to smooth it? My determination was no. But if you wanted practice in modeling to smooth, it was a good piece to do it with, and you'd approach it much like the table. So for the table, right, we knew from last week that we needed to reinforce these exterior edges, top and bottom. And in order to maintain corners, you have to have the reinforcing edges there too. Well, naturally, or just as it happens, when we reinforce these guys, our edges get reinforced as well. That's not the case for the middle. So we had to go in and actually add reinforcing edges going out. And there's a few ways that you could approach this. For this, I continued my edge loops all the way around so that they just connected to their partner on the other side, just to make it as clean as possible. But if we wanted to minimize down our geometry a little bit and not have quite so many cuts, we could have taken this reinforcement edge and tapered it off, either here or maybe even somewhere underneath, which in my opinion doesn't end up making a ton of sense, because we still have to do the same thing on the other side. So why not just connect it? But You know, little things like that you guys will have to determine for yourselves and what's going to be appropriate for your given project. Um, but when we're doing that centerpiece, it's the same principle applies. We, instead of doing it once though, we have to do it for four. Yeah, in which case that's when maybe I would start looking at areas, okay, where can I cut these off and not necessarily wrap all the way around, but again, for something like this on a and I added them in just in case you guys were wanting to do that so you could see. I didn't add the reinforcing corners because I was like, I don't want to go in there and do it. Yeah. But I would probably remove this. If I wasn't going to do it, I'd remove these extra reinforcement edges because I don't need them. I'm not going to reinforce it. And I probably wouldn't reinforce this one with the intention of smoothing it. It's just providing too much information for such a small piece. I'm not going to see it. Yeah. And eventually we're going to start talking about polys that we will keep and polys that we won't keep and things that are dealing specifically with game engines. But for now, I just want you guys to keep in mind how to do it so that we can, at a later date, take that information and start baking it out when we want to. But you didn't have to do this one. No, you guys didn't have to model that to smooth. Yeah.
So it's also not smooth in.
You can't tell. Yeah, you really can't tell. Well, the only thing that, I mean, if you really wanted to get nitpicky, if you, no, actually, no. It's just, it's interpretation. It's interpretation. It really isn't smooth in there. If you wanted to round, if you're gonna round out the corners in the table, maybe I would make an argument for rounding out the corners of that thing. But
Oh, I see.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But otherwise, again, it's kind of open. That one's open for interpretation, and really for you guys at this stage, it's just practice and modeling to smooth and understanding what the concept is. Because we'll start applying that concept to more complex pieces of geometry as we move forward. And how that applies then to our texture maps makes a big difference, particularly in the game engine environment and the VR environment. So, is this optimized for VR right now? No, it's not. That's okay. Yeah.
I was thinking about those screws that go into the. Can you just make a screw, like model a screw, and then just kind of put it in there?
So I did. Yeah. Yeah, and I didn't get too fussy with it in terms of, and in fact, I was toying with some of Max's primitives because they're a little bit different than Maya's. Um, and for something like this, because it's so small, I wouldn't want you guys having this much geometry attached to something so tiny. But I was just toying with it because it was kind of fun. So yeah, I just have these little nuggets in here.
Wow. So there's nothing wrong with kind of sticking another like piece of geometry.
No, not at all. No. Yeah, that's about the extent. It's not fancy. Yeah, and you barely see it, so it's like, okay, how much time do you want to put into it, and how much geometry do you want to waste? Right? Yeah. So what this was, just for funsies, in the extended primitives, there is this object called a ring wave.
Oh.
And you can kind of toy with what the center, if you toy with some of the attributes, it'll adjust what your center geometry is looking like. And it actually does a pretty good job of maintaining, once you toy with the options, it does a pretty good job of maintaining your quads and tries for you. That's a little crazy. I don't know that I go with that, but you know, something to play with. So that's where I started with those screws. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Is my ribbon gone? No. Okay. Cool. Like a hole?
Yeah. Like a paint bucket. Do you know that tool in Paint or Photoshop or whatever? There's like
So are you wanting, okay, let me see if I'm understanding you. There's two routes or two interpretations, I think, of what you're asking me. The first one would be, are you wanting to get rid of the hole and fill it in from the top? Or are you wanting to create a mesh out of it to get the shape? Is that what you're talking about? There's not like a fill tool, at least not that I'm aware of, but what you could do or one of the approaches you could take would be to grab this thing and extract the faces from the center, pull it out, fill the top, and then flip the normals. Yeah, that's what I would do. Mm-hmm. And I've done that for like wine glasses with liquid and stuff. And if I didn't want to go in and create a liquid material, I just wanted it to be simple geometry, I'd create the wine glass, then copy the faces on the interior side so I don't have to try to mesh or mold another piece of geometry to the wine glass. It's already there for me. Just take those faces and extract them out, fill the top, and flip the normals. Now you've got your surface. Same idea.
Top, do you mean
like a cap.
cap?
Yeah. Yeah, and then if you need to go in and, add your cuts in to make sure things are quads, then great, you do that. But that's essentially the best paint bucket that I am aware of anyway. There might be other methods, depending upon the artist, but yeah, that's what I've done. Okay. Any other questions with the modeling component? No? Okay. So I did throw, originally I wasn't gonna do any sort of lecture document, if you will, with regard to the texturing side of it, because I'm going to do some simple demo, and then you guys are going to do it with me in class, and then you guys are going to have class time to do it while I'm walking around and helping. But I did put something up on Basecamp that I think will help just with regard to terminology, because we'll talk a little bit about terminology. Some of this stuff we're going to deal with, others of it we're going to just deal with it in terms of concept, and then we'll address it once we move kind of into that phase of the production pipeline. So if you want to open that up, that's what it's looking like. Okay. So our texturing, this part of it, in my opinion, is the best part, because that's when our textures or our models are going to start to feel like they have a little bit of life to them, rather than dealing with these gray blobs. Right now, we've just been dealing with the default textures, nothing fancy. So within Max, where we are going to jump in, or where we're going to start adding materials, is housed within what's called the material editor. So where you're going to find this, everybody look up here real quick. It's this little icon, and it might look like that for some of you as well. It just depends on what mode we're in. So it's right next to the, or to the left of the teapot with the gear. If I click on that, I'm going to get an interface that either looks like this. How many of you have this interface? None of you? 2 of you? 3 of you? 3 of you? Okay. This is more of a graph style interface. My preference is to use the compact material editor, and that's going to serve us well for what we're going to do today. So what I'd like for you to do is, under the modes, change it to compact material editor. And what you're going to get as an alternative is something that looks like this. Now I've got some colors and things in mind because I've tinkered with it, but generally you guys will have a series of spheres that have just a gray value associated with them. Okay, is everybody to that point? Now, if you want to add more spaces to work with, and generally, I think by default it gives you 6 slots. That's not a whole lot to work with. So under our options menu, we can change the cycle. Just if you click on the X button, or hotkey X, it's going to cycle through how many slots we have available to us. Now, we're not going to use this many for what we're doing, but it's nice to have a little extra space. Okay, so let's talk about some terminology, and some of this, honestly, we've already gone over, so I don't anticipate it taking us very long, but I just want to make sure, or at least have a little bit of review on it, since it's relevant to what we're talking about today. So who can tell me what specularity is? Anybody? I know what specularity, remember what that is? Yeah, that's all it means, highlight. That's a fancy 3D term for highlight. I remember when I was first learning CG, that term got thrown around a lot and no one actually told me what it was. And when I found out, or when I realized what it was, I was like, oh my gosh, why couldn't have someone just told me that? It would have made life so much easier. All it is a fancy 3D word for highlight, right? So if we're looking at a material, it's this highlight point that we see. Now, in the game environment, for the standard stuff that we're dealing with in Unity, it deals with specularity. But once we get into more advanced texturing techniques, and we're going to be talking about metalness and all that other fun stuff that deals with how highlights and reflections are generated on the top of, or generated over the course of our material. But when you hear the word specularity, that's all it means, highlight.
What's the difference between specularity and
albedo? Albedo is the texture itself, it's the color. So if you were going to compare them between, let's say, 3ds Max and Unity, diffuse is the same thing as albedo. This is where we're going to plug our textures into. And all it is it's associating either a color or a texture to put on the top of our geometry. What the specularity is doing is it's telling us where the highlight point is on the geometry or within the map itself. So color versus bright spot. Does that make sense? Yeah. Oh, man down. What was that? Uh-oh.
Oh no.
No tech catastrophes.
Just kind of sitting right on top of it.
All right, we're good over there.
Very stable.
Yeah. Yeah. So then you're gonna have to watch your kneecaps. Okay. Let's see real quick here. Okay. Okay. Transparency or opaqueness. So right now, when we look at our material editor, we've got our samples up here at the top. We've got our ability to save materials and then also apply them down here right below. Where it says default, this is where we would go in and we would start to name our materials. Our shader type. So remember me telling you that, I kind of oops in your Unity notes when I was saying shader versus material. This is why this happens for me, is because in Max and Maya, the materials that we are applying to objects are called shaders, right? And it's a little bit different once you get into the game engine world. So you're going to hear that kind of go back and forth, and sometimes you might have to ask about, what they're specifically referencing. Are you referencing coded materials brought into a game engine, or are you actually referencing something in a CG package? So generally you shouldn't have to ask, but that's what that is. So we can dictate what type of shader we use. And we have some options here. We're only going to really deal with a blend today because that's going to allow us probably the most flexibility. We can make things really reflective with that. We can make things look dull with that. We've got kind of this broad spectrum we can work within. And it'll translate nicely into our Unity environment once we export our models out. Down here, anywhere you see a color swatch, we can click on the color swatch and we can make adjustments to that color. Now we're going to leave our ambient color alone. Really, what that's dealing with is how the light is interacting with the color of the surface on our geometry. When we have this really bright, it's going to make our objects look more cartoony. So we're going to leave it alone. We want to leave it at the default. What we're going to be more concerned about is the diffuse value. That's where we go in and we start adding our color values, or we add our textures. Okay? When you want to add something, you're going to click on the box next to it, and it's going to pull up a browser option for you, and then we can go in and we can select our material. Now we're going to leave this alone for a minute. Well, I'll walk you through how we're going to do our tables and chairs. Okay. Opacity, very much as it sounds. It's dealing with transparency. Okay. Now, we also have the ability to go in and adjust our specular highlight, how much of it we're going to get. And you can see the sample swatch up here before I apply it to any piece of geometry, how my change may be affecting it. So for something like this, it's going to have a really intense highlight. Okay. We may have a little bit in our scene, but we're not going to have probably a great deal of really reflective highlights on our table and chairs, right? Probably not.
Super glossy.
Yeah, it's like a bowling alley. Yeah. For extended parameters, if we click on this option, and actually what I'm looking at is the map, sorry. The additional maps, this is where we can go in and we've got additional attributes that we can toy with. So we can add things to reflections. We can add things to our specular highlight. We can add a bump map, which we'll talk about here in a second. It's not going to be, I want you to know what a bump map is, but it's not something we're going to use really in our gaming environment at all. But it has some similarities to a normal map. And it's good to know the difference. It's something you can do in your CG package, but once you bring it into Unity or Unreal or one of those, it's not going to do a whole heck of a lot. So what bump mapping is it's going to create the illusion of depth, but not alter the geometry. So very similar idea or same idea to what normal mapping is doing. So if we look at, for example, if I were to put a black and white image in the bump map channel of a piece of geometry, this is what I would get. I'm going to get this sort of illusion of depth. Grayscale at 50%, you're not going to have any change. And then depending upon how white or black something is, it's going to dictate how far it appears to recede or push away from the geometry. Now the thing with bump maps, much like normal maps, is you notice how it does not change the silhouette of the geometry. It's not actually pulling that geometry out. If we wanted a map that actually pulled geometry out, we'd utilize what's called a displacement map. That's not something we're going to use in a game engine because it's, well, we're definitely not for the VR side. It's render heavy. It's computationally heavy because if you're using an image to pull geometry out, what do you think you have to have on that geometry to do it? A lot of polygons, yeah, exactly, which is why it's so heavy. Okay. All right. So when you're doing bump maps or when you are utilizing bump maps, that's one of those tricks that can be overdone very easily. And I'll see people go in their 3D environments and they'll toy with it. And they're like, oh man, this is awesome. It's kind of like when people discover Photoshop filters for the first time. And it's like, ooh, look what I can do with this, right? Yeah, emboss. Yeah, exactly. Oh my gosh, yeah. So my rule of thumb with bump maps, if you're going to use them, whether, if you're just sticking within the CG world and you're doing like video or you're doing film or whatever, bump maps should be felt but not seen. That's my rule of thumb with it. So what I mean by that is it shouldn't be smacking you in the face. If I can look at your geometry and say, hey, you got a bump map on there, it's too much.
I'm not understanding what's bad about the one on the right.
This one?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really grainy, and to a trained eye, they'll spot that bump map a mile away.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me see if I can find. I don't know if I have. Yeah. Here.
So you really define it.
Two spheres, like the one on the right is more gritty and grainy.
This isn't a bump map. This is just the texture that's in it.
The one on the right is.
That has to do. That has to do with the render quality. It's just and the image that So let's see real quick. Just for funsies, I'll see if I can find a worse bump map. We'll consort Google. Really bad bump map.
I mean, you might want something to look like that, right? If you're going for that kind of thing.
Generally, you're not going for that kind of thing, though.
Well,
like,
I'm confused, is because to me, I would be like, oh, well, that's like a really beaten up wood floor. I don't know what to look for to see a bump map. Well, I'm looking at it on my screen.
Yeah, hold on. I'm trying to find a bad one. The other thing that you're gonna encounter with bump maps and why it gets tricky is with bump maps, because it's an illusion, I'm just not finding. Come on, you'd think they would give me like a bounty. I've seen more horrible bump maps than I can. I just need a comparison. Okay, let's see if I can just toss something on here quickly. I'll create my own.
Grain on that wood is just so pronounced.
Yeah,
And
it
it's, like,
almost gives
black.
it. So when you've seen the Photoshop filters, right?
Yeah.
Okay, there's one Photoshop filter that's like an ink. It's like it makes it look like a comic.
Oh,
Gives it
yeah.
ink lines and kind of. When you add too much bump map to something, it does that effect.
Okay.
Additionally, what happens is that the bump map closer to the camera is really intense, and as you move further away, the bump map goes away entirely. So you end up with this really intense discrepancy
Yeah.
as you move towards your background.
Gotcha.
Yeah, does that make more sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just,
So you have to be a little careful. You have to be a little careful with it. And you can see some of that discrepancy happening here, even though it's a small image, you can see it. And the reason for that, so just to keep in mind, so for future, if you want to play with this outside of the game environment, the reason why bump maps are behaving in that manner is it's taking three things into account. First is the image that's being applied to generate the bump map to begin with. It's always a grayscale image of some kind. Usually it's a converted grayscale image of whatever texture you brought in. So if I have a wood floor, for example, I have a wood floor texture in my diffuse channel. And a very quick and dirty way to create the bump map for it would be to take that same wood texture, pull it into Photoshop, convert it to a grayscale image, put that into your bump channel. Now, can you put RGB images in a bump channel? Yes, you can. You'll get a bump result. It's just not going to be as accurate. Bump channels really look specifically to grayscale images to create the effect. So that's the first thing that it's going to look at is the grayscale image affecting the bump. The other thing it's going to look at are the other two things: lighting and camera angle relative to the object that you're looking at. So what bump maps are doing is on the surface of your geometry, it's looking at these normals, right? We've talked about normals. Can you guys tell me what a normal is? Yeah, yeah, it's the outside face. So, like if I'll take my, so if I'm looking at my phone and this is a poly face, right? My normal is going to be sticking out 90 degrees from it, generally by default. Yeah, and it's the facing angle. So this is the front side of my face. This is the back side of my face. This is the side that renders, right? So what it's looking at, or what it's trying to do, is it's taking your grayscale image and the lighting and how we're looking at it, and it's doing a play on those normals to give us the impression that there's depth there, even though that there isn't. So it's like magic, right? So
and so then
I
that's
guess it's
also
a
the
four.
relationship to normal mapping.
Kind of.
Right?
Yeah.
Because-
The easy answer to that is yes.
Valid.
Okay. So because you have all of these things that are going into this illusion, that's why you're going to get some of that discrepancy as the camera move, or as the camera is seeing things in the foreground versus the background. It's why lighting, when you adjust the lighting, can have a dramatic role in what your bump maps look like. Your grayscale image will have a dramatic effect on what your bump maps look like. And then we do have attributes within Max and Maya that you can go in and you can adjust the bump depth, meaning we can dictate how much of this effect are we seeing. Do we want it to be really intense, or do we not want it to be subtle? I always on the err on the side of subtle. Subtle's more. It's kind of like, I liken it to the walls, right? If you guys, even sitting in your desk, you know that there's a little bit of texturing on this wall, but can you see the individual specks? No. That's what I mean by felt but not seen. You know what I mean? So we know it's there, and if we get right up on top of it, yeah, we can see it. But generally speaking, we know it's there without actually having it smack us in the face. So that's the thing with bump maps is we want to utilize them, but utilize them sparingly. They're the cheapest way in 3D to get the illusion of depth. And they will get you a good long way. Generally, I don't put them though on things where we're going to really focus in on them. Because of some of the abnormalities we can get with regard to the stuff we were just talking about, but there are ways you can dodge around that as well. So for example, we could animate the level of bump depth we get as the camera moves forward. Or we could animate what our light is doing as our camera is shifting around an object. So there are ways to dodge around it, but you have to kind of understand what goes into them in order to troubleshoot for them. All right. Okay. So just some CG terminology. Okay, so then that brings us to normal mapping. When you're in a gaming environment, which is very similar to our VR environments, or identical with the exception of some minor tweakage, normal mapping is what we're going to use. It's very, very similar to bump mapping, but it calculates it in a very different way. So it's a technique that it's used to fake lighting of bumps, dents, and specifically we're getting that information from high poly models. So we can use this to make a game model or a low poly model appear like the high poly model without actually having to bring in that extra geometry. So what we're doing is we're taking that high poly information, we're baking it into a texture. We're taking that texture and applying it to the lower poly version, and that's how we're getting that information, which is why even though down the road we're not going to bring our high poly into Unity, I want you to know how to create it because we need it to generate the normal mapping.
Why does a normal map not have high poly? Is that the baking thing?
Ask me that question one more time.
Well, so how can it have the appearance of high poly without actually having high poly?
It's the same.
There's like data.
It's the same reason that bump maps give us the appearance of depth without actually giving us depth. Same idea. It's yeah, it's a 2D image that we're bringing in, and it's just like it's just doing it in a different way. It's doing it in a much more detailed way, a much higher quality way, and it's generating it rather than generating it specifically from an image like this is. It's generating it from the high poly versions that we created. Now, could we create normal maps from images? Yes, we can do that too. And likely you might do a combination of both. And there are pieces of software that once we get really heavy into the texturing side, we're going to talk about how to do that because there's some really great software that gives us that ability. We can do some of it in Max, although I think there are packages that deal with it better. Yeah.
So are you thinking high poly models and then geometry and then putting the
In a very, yes, in a nutshell, yes. Yeah. So, yes. Yeah, okay, yeah, exactly. So right now, like on some of the stuff you guys had your turbo smooth, right? All right, so we take the turbo smooth information, rather than bringing our turbo smooth model into Unity, we'd bake that information out into a texture to make it look, have it be smooth and rounded, and apply that to the non-turbo smooth piece of geometry in Unity. So rather than bringing in all of those poly faces, we're bringing in the fewer poly faces and applying it as a texture. That's it. Yeah.
And like automatically.
You mean like decimate it down? Like yes, yes, and there are yes. So we can retopologize something. We can decimate geometry down. It kind of depends on what package you're in. There are software packages meant specifically to do that. So like Simply Gone is a really good one where you can bring high poly models in and it will reduce your poly count for you. So yes, and you will do that. There will be times where you will absolutely do that. Oh yeah, yeah. Wait, you did? How did you do that?
I used this other thing.
What'd you use?
Um,
Do I want to know?
sure. Yeah, it's under, let's see, I'll select it's all in modeling. It's not going to
Because there are some other things that you guys that we'll toy with.
subdivision mesh. And it's not like a drop down in that area, it's in the top right. And it's on the side of the volley. You have to have like fixed volley model. And then, yeah, it's under subdivision on that second row. And then mesh smooth, and if you click that, mesh smooth settings.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the only thing that you're gonna want to, if you guys use that kind of thing, it's kind of like the difference between using your adjustments in the main menu of Photoshop versus adjustment layers. Same idea. One's destructive and one isn't. Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah, yeah, yeah. What's that? Unperma turbo smooth. Yeah, so there, yeah, you can absolutely. And depending upon where we go with this too, if you ever start to get to a point where you're sculpting geometry and things like ZBrush, I mean, you're going to be working with millions of polys at that point when you're in a package like that, and you have to be able to decimate it down into something manageable for a game engine, or it's just not going to function. So.
But for film, like you said, like
for film, you guys can get away with a lot more, yeah.
so you're just basically rendering it. And...
Well, you would still potentially, because here's the thing you have to consider. Could you use it like that? Yes, now you could. Back in the day, you definitely couldn't. But could you now? Yeah. The only tricky part is that with that much geometry, you're looking at increased render time. And so if you're under a deadline, it might actually benefit you to decimate it, put a map on it, than to just use just for render time's sake. Because I mean, you could be looking at the difference between rendering over the course of a day or rendering over the course of a week, depending upon what your geometry is doing. So, but yeah, in the film and advertising side, we can get away with a lot more when it comes to geometry. Now, do I think that's changing in the game world? Yeah, I do. And you've already seen it in the last like 5 years. You've seen this shift where it used to be like, oh my God, get your try count down the lowest possible thing, and now it's like, okay, well, do we can get away with having more? Do I think maybe at some point we're just going to have quads, a transfer of quad to quad? Yeah, because the system's going to be able to handle it. So I envision over the next 10 years or so, we're probably not going to be any different between whether you're in a film, advertising, or game environment. I mean, the hardware is evolving so rapidly. This is crazy. So, but for now, we do have to keep in mind that, yeah, that's a thing we have to consider. And particularly for VR and AR, it absolutely is something we'll have to consider because we need to keep our frame rate so high. And in doing that, we have real time rendering happening. And if it's having to do real time rendering on really high poly models, you're gonna see flickering, you're gonna see things happen. And even today, we haven't done this to optimize it down for a VR environment. Eventually, we'll get to that point. But one thing you may notice, and when we put this in HoloLens, for example, we might see a little flickering because of it. We will probably won't see the flickering so much in Oculus because it's going to handle it a little bit better. But for HoloLens, you might. We'll see, depending upon what you guys got going on in your models. Yeah.
This might be a pin for later conversation, but I don't want to forget to ask it. It was suggested that Unreal is better than Unity for dealing with art. That it's
Yes. Okay. I mean, yes. There are definite pros and cons to working with one over the other. Unreal Engine in particular is a lot more user friendly, particularly from an artist perspective. The thing is, there isn't Unreal Engine support for HoloLens right now, which is why we're in Unity. Eventually, would I like to switch over to Unreal? Yeah. I think it's going that direction where there will be support for the HoloLens for that. But on the flip side of that, Unity's interface is really pretty straightforward to use. If you're working within a Maya or Max environment, the transition over is super easy. the general setup is very similar. Um, so it just makes moving in and out, particularly when you're learning those pieces of software for the first time, it makes it the transition easier. So that's the other reason why we're in Unity. But yeah, there are some huge benefits to being in an Unreal environment. Yeah, good question. And we may, if down the road, if HoloLens comes up with some Unreal support, I would love to shift us into that. That'd be great. Um, but we can do a lot with Unity. We can do a lot with Unity. It's just a little bit different process. So, good question. Okay. So, with regard to the textures, when you're in your CG package, there's a couple different types that we can work with. We can work with procedurals and we can work with files. With the idea that we're moving into a game engine, we're going to work with files. And generally, I work with files anyway. And what that means is we're creating our own JPEGs or our own PNGs or our own Targas to bring in. So we can bring it into Max, we can bring it into Unity, we can do whatever we want with it. What procedurals are textures that are generated within the program that you slap onto your geometry, like a checker, for example. So if we were going to look at one of these, let's say we wanted to put some kind of procedural in our diffuse channel. That's what all of these are. Checker, cellular, denting, noise. Like, we've got all these things that Max generates for us that we can slap on our textures, but generally they're not going to translate over very well to our game engine environment. Could we get away with using some of this in more of an advertising film world? Yeah. Yeah, we could. The main difference for procedurals, they are not dependent on resolution, where we have to look at that. Remember, I was talking about the raster images versus vector. This is kind of like a vector world, right? So it's not so dependent on the resolution of whatever thing we're bringing in. It's going to adjust according to the size of our scene. We don't have to worry about tiling, and our 2D stuff will be seamless. The tough part is they can take longer to render in a film world. They're a little tougher to create realistic looking details because you have to really go in and fuss with the attributes to make them look like something other than just the generic thing they gave you. Because just like Photoshop filters, if you just slap one of those on something, a trained eye is going to see it a mile away. So you really have to fuss with it and integrate it to make it look like something natural. And for us, it doesn't work so well in our transition into the headsets. So we're going to stick with files. They're going to render a little more quickly. We're going to be able to produce detail faster. So for example, if I wanted to come in here and try to create a wood floor out of a bunch of these procedurals, it's going to take me some time. However, I could just go online and find a wood floor texture and slap it into my diffuse channel, and I'm off and running. It already looks like a wood floor. I don't have to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. Okay. The more challenging side with dealing with this, however, is it is resolution dependent, so we have to factor that in. What size is our image? How big is it? And we have to deal with tiling. So I know we've talked about tiling a little bit, but anybody want to give me a quick rundown on what I mean by that? When I say something's tiled, what do I mean? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So let's say, I have, if I have, let's say, a wood floor texture and it's held within this image. Okay. And let's say this is 512 pixels by 512 pixels. If it's tileable, what that means is I can repeat it and I can put another one next to it. And I'm not going to be able to tell where that transition point's happening. So it's going to be much better for me, especially in a game environment, for that to have to read in an image that's only 512 pixels versus, say, something that's gigantic to cover that space. Let's say 248 by 200, or excuse me, 2048, or bumped up to a 4K or whatever, 6K. We want to try to get an image that we can repeat over the surface of a piece of geometry
make it look like it's one giant one, even though it's a smaller, tiny one. Being utilized more often. Now for us,
we can create our own, or we can go online and we can find some. Generally, if you're working in a studio somewhere, you're doing a combination of both. Yeah. Yes. We're gonna do that in a minute. Yeah, and we will. So for you guys, my recommendation, there's a site that I have on your syllabus, but we'll go to it now. It's called textures.com. This is going to be a site that we can go to and allow us to download a variety of texture options, most of which are already tiled for us. That takes a lot of work out of the equation for you guys at this stage.
Are there any moral, ethical, professional implications of using other people's?
That's what this site is for. It's meant for artists to download. Yeah. So no. Now, if you were going on there and you were going to go to Google and you were going to find someone's stuff somewhere and use it verbatim and not, yeah, right. But this site is specific for artists to go to download material from. Create yourself a username and a login, or a username and a password. And I think for the free membership, it gives you like a limit of maybe 10 or 15 downloads a day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's quite a bit. I've never had to do a membership for this, and I've been using it for years. I don't usually need to download that kind if I'm going to tap into this. If you wanted something that was on the more premium side, you can pay for the membership. I don't remember what the membership is, but when you register, you'll find it. Premium access, I think that's what it is. Oh yeah, free credits, free downloads every day. You can download small, medium sizes, and that's fine. That's what you guys want, because most of which are going to be tiled. That's what you're looking for, generally speaking. So you typically wouldn't need those larger sizes. If you're going to do a larger size, what you'd be looking for would be things like environment maps and HDRI images and that kind of thing, but that's not going to be something we're going to dive into. So if you wanted to buy credits to have some wiggle room to get larger maps when you want them, they give you options for credit purchase. But like I said, I've never had to tap into that in the years I've been using it. So it's pretty straightforward, but we're, let's say, for example, in my scene that I want to pull into my VR stuff, let's say I want to have a wood floor. So, okay, I'm going to go to wood. Let's look at, I got lots of options here. So I can go into find wood. I can scroll down. Let's see. Oh, here's a bunch of wood floors. Okay, cool. So if I click on this, what you guys are looking for when you hover over an object, an image in general, is up in that upper right hand corner. It's going to tell you what size options are available, and it's going to tell you if it's a tileable texture by indicating the seamless up in the upper right hand corner. So when we click on this, what you guys will look for is this small download. So a 1024, it's a nice little 1K image that's going to repeat over the surface of our geometry, and we're not going to be able to tell that it's repeating. That's what we're looking for. Would you need something that's an 8,000 by 8,000? No, please. I don't recommend that for your, especially for your VR worlds. Yeah, this would be gigantic. We don't need it. So, if we're looking at this from just a simple broken down perspective, this is what this is doing. It's taking that single image, it's repeating it, putting it together, and making it look like one thing. And we can repeat it over that surface however many times we need to in order to cover the surface. Commonly tiled textures that you guys would go in and work with: concrete, stone, painted surfaces, bricks, hardwood floors, right? Things that you would expect to see in your typical environments that are over the across large bodies of matter, right? Walls, stuccos, that kind of stuff. Here's an example. So this would be an image, and then this is repeated over the surface of this cylinder. That's a tiled texture. And we can't tell where this image ends or begins. Right? So no seam lines or patterns. That's a good thing. That's what we want. Okay. Tiled textures that aren't so good. This would be an example If we start to see the seam lines, and sometimes they're really in your face and other times they're very subtle, but our eyes just by nature have a very keen sense in picking up patterns. And so if you have an image or you're utilizing an image that has a natural pattern in it or has a blemish mark or something that's really visible to us, it might not be so visible to us in the single image, but as soon as we start repeating that image over the course of the surface of the geometry, we're going to pick up on it like that. Cats. Very keen in that sense. So this, we can see the seam line, and we can even, it's a little harder to tell on the upper part, but definitely where the ends and begins. And then on this grass texture, this dark spot, that gives it away real quick. This little bright spot gives it away real quick. As soon as those two things meet, we're seeing it everywhere. So we do have to be careful what images we're picking. I will tell you the images on textures.com tend to be pretty good. I have yet to come across one that's like really just, I can't use it. If it says it's seamless, right?
Are there other, you could figure
Yeah. Yeah, you could do that in your photo. Like we're not gonna go into learning Photoshop today. We just don't have the time. I would love to do that, but yes, you can. Yes, you can. Yeah, you absolutely could. You could go in and you could configure it. And I do have a little quick, hey, if you guys want to toy with the Photoshop side on making a tileable texture, these are some of the tools that you would utilize. So for those of you who are Photoshop savvy and want to toy with it, you're welcome to do that, but you guys won't need to. Most of what you're going to find on the textures.com will get you where we need to get for this particular class. Okay. So things that would be hopefully obviously non-tileable textures. You know, this kind of stuff. Or something like this. Now, could we potentially take a little chunk of this and make it tileable? Sure. But why would this not be a tileable texture? Yeah, it's got way too many unique features in order for us to repeat it and have it blend. Right? This thing would come up everywhere. This, I mean, it's just very, yeah, it's just too unique. Okay. So does that make sense? Are there any questions? Yeah.
So in looking at like wood grain, for example, how can one identify as an artist which components are not going to be noticeable when repeated? Or is
As
that
soon as
you just really kind of develop?
You'll develop that over time. The other thing is when in doubt, test it out. That is my thing for a lot of this stuff. I mean, sometimes you just can't, you don't know until you get it on the geometry and it's like, oh wow, I can really see that. I didn't think I was going to, but yeah, it's on a big enough surface. I can't hide it. It's there. I got to fix it. It's hard to tell when it's just flat like this sometimes. But
like, you know, like the knots in the wood and things like that. Like I would assume.
Yeah, so you'll know, I mean, you will develop it over time, but some things will be really evident. Let's find one that's not like something like that. All right, that's pretty evident. Something like this, you're gonna start to pick up like this thing right here, and it's not tileable for this reason. We can see that. But yeah, this stuff we pick up on. Yeah, high contrast.
Well, so
Yeah.
in that one that's in the upper left hand corner right now, it says left. It says it's seamless, but I feel like that white one that's right in the middle would stand out.
It might. It's again, we'd have to test it. It's degrees of, right? There's not going to be a perfect. There are textures that I brought in. I'm like, okay, this is interesting. We'll see if it works. If it's a smaller object, you can get away with a lot. If you're doing it over the course, let's say I've got like 20 cityscape buildings I'm trying to throw this thing on, and it's like all around me. Oh, that might show up. So, I mean, it might be seamless, and then I can't tell where the lines are, but I still may pick up patterns.
Oh,
and there is a difference there.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah, there is a difference there.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you and again, test it out, and then yeah, over time you're gonna get a pretty good feel for it without having to test it out. But even then, you still may need to. So, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Mm-hmm.
Probably getting ahead of ourselves, but what if you wanted to use like one of those little knots or some little unique thing like in a certain spot of your
Yeah, so what I would do, and we're gonna talk about what UV layout. We're not gonna do it today. We're gonna, and Brendan's like, yeah, yeah. I would love that. It would be great. All right, 1 hour, go. We'll talk about what it is, and I'll show you what it is, but we're not gonna do it. So what you would want to do is take your seamless texture and then grab that knot from your image and overlay it in like Photoshop. And then we can take that image and put it onto our. So there's going to be a lot of, when you guys are starting to really create textures for very specific things, you're going to have to manipulate images in some type of photo manipulation package. That's, if you're not, I would say if you're not familiar with Photoshop and you plan on taking the next class, it might be something that you get a little, it'll just introduce yourself. I mean, I'm going to teach it as if people have not utilized it, and we'll go into substance and some other things that people have never utilized before. But it does absolutely help. If you're going to be a texture artist of any kind, you have to know how to manipulate images for exactly reasons like that. I want a knot right here. How do I get it there? All right. How do I blend it in to the texture that's underneath it and make it look like it belongs there? Yeah. So you just overlay and blend. Yeah. Okay. So what I have done for my max file, we're going to keep this fairly simple, but if you guys want to explore and toy with it, by all means, please do. I'm going to keep this demo simple because I want you guys to get some materials on your geometry so that we can then work on getting them into the headsets. And then I also want to have time to come around and see where you guys are with regard to assignments that you've done in the, turned in or haven't turned in. For those of you who have some things that are kind of still hanging out in the distance here, we'll have this next week for all you guys to make sure you get everything turned in that you need to get turned in. But okay, so I've downloaded some materials already, and I have them in my scene assets images folder. That's where Max is going to look for materials. So when you guys are throwing your images into your project structure, this is where it should go: scene assets and images. Now, I will say this: I have found Max, and this isn't a new thing. It's been over the years. I have found Max to not always do a great job of recognizing the project structure as easily as Maya does. So you have to really force it sometimes, but as long as things are in the correct locations, even if they get disconnected, we can actually pretty easily reconnect stuff. And I had to do this a lot. It used to drive me crazy between the two packages. If for some reason you open up your project structure and your textures become disconnected, we have an option in our drop down. Well, I gotta find it. File properties? No. Hold on, I was just in it earlier. Oops. Maybe it's in. No. Where are you? I feel like I'm looking right past it. I know I am. No. File properties, manage, references. Oh yeah, references. Thank you. It's asset tracking. If we go into asset tracking, what it's going to do is it's going to pull up all the things in our scene or our textures that we have created, and it's going to say, hey, I'm missing files for this. If you select them, you right mouse click, you can set the path for where those files are, so we can force it to look in the images folder. That's a quick way to set it in the event it breaks. Okay. So I have some textures that I've downloaded, and these are the ones I'm going to draw from. They're downloaded from textures.com. Most of them are anyway. So let's start with simple. If we're going to just mimic the table as it is in the reference image, the frame of the table and chairs is pretty easy. It's basically a blue paint. So, all right, I'm gonna come in here and I'm gonna create, and let's actually, materials. I want to reset this. Options. Nope, that's not what I want. Okay, well, we'll work down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select one of my slots that I want this texture to be housed out of. For you guys, maybe to start in the upper left-hand corner, I have some stuff here already, so I can actually just, I'll just get rid of these. There we go. Okay, so we'll start in the upper left-hand corner. And what I would like to do is I would like to pull in, or maybe just create the blue for my frame. So if I click on the material in the diffuse, this is where I'm going to click on the color swatch. I'm going to come into the color swatch and I'm going to select or change up the color to whatever I want it to be. So for the reference images, it's kind of a nice dark blue, so that's when I'm going to adjust it. I'm going to hit OK. Once I have the color that I want, I can go in, and if I want to give it a little bit of highlight, I can by adjusting this specular level. Now, there's not really a whole heck of a lot of reflection or glossiness to that paint, so I'm going to actually turn my spec level down to 0. Now, to apply this to an object in my scene, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the object. And then right underneath my material slots, there's this assign material to selection. If I click on that, it's going to assign whatever material is in that slot to whatever I have selected in my viewport. So if I want to apply this to the legs of my chair, assign. Okay, and I want to make sure that it's named appropriately, so I'm going to call this blue frame. And I could say it's for table and chairs both. Okay. After the fact, let's say I want it to be a little darker. Okay, great, I'll darken that up. All right, fine. So, let's say we now want to move to our tabletop. Let's add a wood texture to our tabletop. So I've got a wood texture in here. I'll show you what that looks like. So it's this one that I'm using. This is the texture. It's tileable. You guys can go download whatever ones you want. You're going to have time to play with it today. So, you know, whatever texture you guys want to use is fine by me. It doesn't matter. I'm loosely mimicking what's in the reference image. So, what's that? Scene assets, images. Yeah. All right. So this one, I'm going to make wood. Wait, I'll call this table, chair, wood, just wood. Because I'm going to apply the same texture that I've got to the tabletop, also to the chair seat. So I want to bring in that wood texture. Here's how I do that. In my diffuse channel, there's a little box next to it, next to the swatch. If I click on that, it's going to pull up my material browser. I'm going to choose the very top option called bitmount. And when I do that, if my project structure is set, it should drop me right into my images file. I'm going to select the image that I want and hit open. Now, just like I did before, I'm going to select the object that I want to put it on, and I'm going to assign material to selection. Now, if you don't see it in your viewport, what we need to click is this little button right underneath our shaders. It's called Show Material in Viewport. If I click on that, I should now see my material on my piece of geometry. Okay. Now, here's the thing that we're going to talk about. Well, actually, let's get our textures on first, and then we'll talk about the UVs and all that fun stuff. I'm just going to throw textures on first. They might not be placed or sized the way we want. And if you scroll in here, you can see that, see how it's kind of icky on my corners or on my edges? Not so nice here. Okay on the top, but not so great otherwise. So we'll talk about how to adjust that without having to go into UV sets and stuff. All right, so if I want to get back to the root of my texture, because right now what it's put me in is attributes specific to adjusting that texture map, all you have to do is click on the go to parent icon. It's a little up arrow, and that'll get us back to the menu that we were at. There's this little guy. And I can toy with her. Do I want my wood topper to be a little glossy? Okay, great. I can give it some highlight. I can adjust how glossy this is. So what this is doing under the glossiness is it's adjusting how pinpointed the highlight is. Generally, when you have something that's super, super shiny, like chrome, for example, the highlight is really compact. When you have something that's a little less reflective or glossy, like maybe a brushed metal, for example, the highlight's a little more diffuse across the surface of the geometry. So that is what this is adjusting, is do we want that to be a really broad shadow or do we want it to be really pinpointed? And you can see how it adjusts up here. See the difference in my highlight right there versus something that's broader? Yeah. So just a bit depends on the type of material that you're trying to mimic. For something like this, I'm going to go kind of somewhere in the middle with that. As if that wood has a bit of a varnish on it. Now, if it's a kid's table, probably wouldn't put any gloss on there. All right, maybe some crayons, crayon work. We'll go paint some crayon stuff on this. All right, let's say we want to do a metal texture for this metal piece. So I'm going to click to the next slot. I'm going to name my material, table. Well, let's just call it, I'll just call it metal. Now in my diffuse, I'm going to click on the button again, choose bitmap, and I'm going to select whatever metal material I want to bring in. I hit open. Move up to the parent of my texture. I don't have to do that right now, but make sure that whatever object is selected, I want to apply it to is selected in my viewport, and I'm going to assign that material. If I don't see it, remember you got to make sure to show material in viewport, and it'll start to show that. So right now I have kind of the foundational, or basically I have the foundational textures for my table and chairs. I'm going to use the same wood texture for the seat of my chair so I can apply it there. And I'm going to use the same metal texture that I'm using for the centerpiece for the bolts. So I'm going to select my bolts and assign my metal texture. Okay. Yeah.
If you have like duplicate of the chair and you're doing all this stuff, is it gonna go on to the other chair?
Yes.
Or?
Yeah, if we do, which is why I had some duplicates in here and I removed them, because as soon as I apply textures to this and then I duplicate the chair, the textures will go with it.
Right.
Yeah.
So you want to do the texture before you duplicate it? Won't.
I would. Yeah, I would.
Go on to the other.
No, it's not like a prefab in that way.
Okay.
No.
And I also discovered you have to ungroup.
Well, you can open your group. Okay, so let's say here I'll show you. So let's say I have this table grouped. Right. Oop, that wasn't quite what I was going for. Come on. Oh, you son of a gun. There we go. Okay, so table. All right, so I have this grouped and I can't like select on my individual pieces. If you go to the group option and you choose open, now I can go in and then when I'm done, close the group and you're good to go.
So you don't have to like rename.
No.
What does open recursive mean?
That's a good question. I've not used that. Let's find out. No idea.
Okay. Cool.
Like that answer?
That's awesome.
Yeah. All right. For the sake of not having to open and close my group, I am going to ungroup it for now. But it doesn't really matter. You can do it either way. Okay. So, yeah.
Is there a way to sample a color, like if you want to get from the table legs? Is there a way to like bring in?
Oh, so, yeah. I see what you're saying. Yes. Yeah, we've got this eyedropper. So if we had an image in there, like if you brought in your reference image, for example, we could use the eyedropper
But it would have
in
to
reference.
be like
We would need, yeah, we would need it in the environment to sample it from. But yeah, or you could bring it, I mean, if you didn't want to bring it in here, we could bring it into Photoshop and sample it there and get the RGB numbers and then plug the RGB numbers in here. Yeah, there's a few ways we could do that. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's say, actually, this will be a good time. We'll talk about the UVs versus the kind of the projections that we're essentially going to do. Yeah.
So
What's that? Yes. Yeah, which is what we're going to do right now. It's not going to be a perfect fix because we're not going to do UV layout, but it'll get us a long way. So let's talk about a little bit. Let's first talk about what UV layout is so that you know what I'm talking about when I'm referencing it. Okay. So for every piece of geometry, everywhere we have a vertice, we have a corresponding UV. It's called a UV. It's another little hidden point in there. And all that's giving us is information about where this piece of geometry is in space. So what we can do is we can take that information and we can use it to basically take this piece of geometry and lay it flat like on a 2D canvas so that we can paint over the top of it in Photoshop or some other application and then bring it back into our environment, and our textures are going to lay where we want them to in the space because we've embedded it into the Photoshop or we've embedded it into the image. So here's how we would do something like that on a very simple, and I personally don't like to use Max's UV editor. I think there's other options out there. I like to use what's called Hedis UV layout, and when we do it, that's what we're going to toy with. We'll go in and out of Max's thing and then Hedis. So it's kind of like taking your 3D model and laying it out flat like roadkill. And then we just paint over the top of the roadkill. And then we bring it back into our 3D environment. We're good to go. We don't really have to fuss with it a whole heck of a lot because it's already embedded in the image. So if I was going to do that for a piece of, like just a simple piece of geometry, let's grab like just a cylinder. Okay. So I have this cylinder and I would like to lay it flat so I can paint on it so that it affords me the ability to go into Photoshop. I can do my wood grain texture on the bottom. I can overlay, let's say, a wood knot where I want it to. And because I have the UV reference underneath, it's showing me where on the geometry I'm placing that wood knot. So I'm just doing it right in Photoshop, and when I bring it back in, it's going to be placed in the spot I want it to in CG space. Right now, I don't really have that. And what we would need to even see that information would be called the UV editor. So let's look at what the UVs look like right now. If I add a modifier on here called unwrap UVs, this is an editor that we can go in and we can do this right within 3ds Max. Again, I kind of don't like, I've learned other ways and it's just something that I've stuck with, but you're more than welcome to toy with this if you want to. But within this, we can go into our UV editor, and this is what this thing looks like. So if I were to lay out my cylinder flat right now, this is problematic because what's happening is this is the outside, these are the poles, and they're all sitting right on top of each other. So if I were going to paint on this, my textures are going to be sitting awkwardly in weird spots. Does that make sense so far? Okay. So I would like to go in and fix this. I don't want this. I want them to be separated in the areas that I want them to be separated in. I want them to be not overlapping each other so that when I paint, it's going into the spots that I want. So here's one way that I can do this. If we're going to use something like Hedis UV layout, which actually you guys can download for and do trials for free. I think I have it on your syllabi, but I'll show you where to get it. So if you type in Hedis UV layout, it'll be the very first thing that pops up. This thing is just meant specifically to deal with UVs, nothing else. It's not changing your 3D model in any way. It's simply dealing with the UVs. So for example, this is some character that was laid out like roadkill so that we could paint over the top of it. If you go to the try tab, download the executable for whatever system you're on. So for some of you, this would be PC, some of you would be Mac. Although I will tell you, I have yet to get it to function on a Mac. Don't know. I don't know what I'm missing with this install, but I've not gotten it to work. And it could be my lack of Mac expertise. Mostly I just curse at Macs. So it could be part to that. That's my experience. Which is funny because back in the day I used to be exclusively a Mac user. And then I switched and never went back. Yeah. Well, and part of it is because the game side of things is so PC dominant, but and the PCs tend to afford you greater ability to go in and really tinker with stuff, which is also the good thing and the problematic thing at the same time, right? Anyway, so when you download this, you have a 45-day trial. Now I will tell you, I've never had issues. Once the 45-day trial is up, they'll let you re-download it and start another 45 days. So it's fully functional, with the exception of some things. There are some added bells and whistles in the professional version and the hobbyist version. If you tried it and you liked it and you wanted to get a license, I recommend, of course, you always buy the license. It's not expensive as far as licenses go. I think the professional license is about $300, which if you compare to Max or Maya's $3,000, not too bad, right? So you can download this. The install takes less than a minute or two. It's very fast. So to do this, I would select my piece of geometry, and this would be before you do this, before you add your textures. Lay out your UVs, and then we can go in and Photoshop and add our textures and bring it back in. So I'm going to export this out. I'm going to choose export selected, and I'm going to export it as an OBJ. You can see I was messing with it earlier. So we'll call UV test 2. Okay, I'm going to export it. I'm just going to leave all the default options, not a big deal. Okay, so what I'm seeing here on an OBJ export, these extra files that get generated are the material files, or these guys. I don't need the materials. I'm not exporting materials out. I just need the OBJ itself, which is what these are. So what you're going to do when you install Hedis, it's going to give you a little icon on your desktop like this. Just drag it over to the UV layout interface. It's a really kind of basic, I'm trying to get it.
That's the old school right there.
Yeah, it is, right? Sort of this weird kind of DOS-like environment. All right, so what we're going to do, we're going to work in polys. We're going to do a new UV layout. I'm going to choose load. And I'm going to see my model come in to this UV space. Uses the same hotkeys that we're using currently. Makes it real easy. So I'm holding down Alt and I'm navigating. Now the thing we'll want to be conscious of in our display options, I think by default this display options is set to a Z up axis. So remember me telling you to be conscious of what axis is up in the environments you're working in. This is a great example of that. By default they look at Z up. We're a Y up or we're going to be a Y up environment. So we need to change that so that we're not moving around in funky ways. You'll know real quick when you do it and you start moving around, it's going to feel weird. So what I need to do and what I'm looking at with this really is just the model represented in a UV fashion. When I start cutting this thing apart, I'm not cutting the model apart. I'm just addressing the UV side of it. So for something like this, what I want to do is I want to detach the two poles so that I can take the center part and lay it flat, kind of like I'm doing, like I'm sewing, right? It's like a sewing project. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to select the edges that I want to cut, and don't worry about the hotkeys and stuff for this because I'm not having you guys do this, but we will eventually do it. I just want to have you tuck it in the back of your heads. All right. So I'm detaching that, and then I'm creating a seam line right down the side, cutting it in half, and then I'm dropping this into a UV editor space. There we go. Okay. All right. So this is kind of like what I was looking at within Max. This is the UV space, that UV editor, same idea. So now I need to lay this stuff flat. So if I take this and I stretch it out, I now have a flat part of the center part of that cylinder. Whatever I do in this interface is going to get represented in Max. So much cleaner than what I had before, right? Okay. Now what I can do is I can take this information and I can bring it into Photoshop and I can just paint right over the top of it. Wherever my brush strokes are with regard to my geometry is where it's going to show up in my 3D space. So that's the direction we're going to be heading. Right? Now it takes a little bit to kind of get this down, because for games there are some very specific things we'll have to consider, like overlapping UVs and that kind of stuff, and how the normals are going to work. But once I'm ready to go, I'm going to choose save, and I like to save this indicating that the UVs have been laid out. I'm going to save it as an OBJ. Close this out. I don't need it anymore. Okay, great, great. Now I've got my Hedis version sitting in here. So if I go back to 3ds Max, I can delete my original and import the one with the pretty UVs. Import. Okay. Now let's look at, now by default it imported in as an editable mesh. We just need to make sure we convert it over to a poly because we're working in polys. Now if I add that UV editor, my UVs are what they were in Hedis. Yeah. And I can take this, create my maps in Photoshop, bring it in. They're going to lay exactly where I tell them to lay. And I don't have to fuss with it. Okay. So that's a snapshot of UV layout. We're going to get to that point. For now, what we're going to do is we're going to utilize Max's version of Maya's projections. And it's going to try to do some of the work for us. Now, it's not going to be perfect solution, but it'll get us a long way. So to do this, yeah.
Is there a way to put like number markers or something like that so you can kind of know where you are on the thing, or is it usually just really obvious?
You can, yeah. So sometimes you might pull your texture, like a test texture in. Yeah. And before you do it in your Photoshop file, maybe you put like some X marks.
Oh, okay.
You could totally do that.
Okay.
Generally, you're not going to be unwrapping something as simple as just a cylinder, right. And so you have some visual reference. Like particularly if you're doing characters, you're going to know, okay, there my eyes are right there, my nose is right there. Right. But sometimes, yeah, you kind of need to go in and maybe put some markers down. You can do that. Yeah. And you'll see them show up. As soon as you save your Photoshop file, if you've already brought it in and you've applied it to your geometry, go in, edit, 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 hit save. You'll see it update. Yeah, really nice. Yeah. Okay, so for something like this, I've modeled this to smooth. So let's add my, I'm going to add my turbo smooth here. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add my, rather than adding this unwrap UVW, I'm going to choose UVW map. And that's going to give me some projections to work with. So for something like this, I have found that the box projection works pretty well. So what happens, and you'll see how I've got a controller in here, and I can go in and I can manipulate the size of that controller. So see where my edges before were really squished and they looked kind of awful? Now I can go in and I can adjust how we're stretching that texture over the surface of that area based off how it's being projected from this box. So I can come in and toy with this and adjust placement and adjust how it's tiling. Maybe I want to flip stuff. I can come in and I can manipulate it in the viewport by choosing manipulate and do it kind of more interactively. I can choose to fit it right on adhere to the shape of the geometry. Now, not always will that give us exactly what we want here. So, I don't want my edges to be so flat and icky. So this is going to be something you guys can go in and toy with, but this will allow us to manipulate the surface of or allow us to manipulate our texture without having to do UV layout. And it'll get us a pretty good way, but in some instances, there's going to be areas that aren't perfect. That's okay. This isn't meant to be a perfect system. If you want perfection, you have to do UV layout. All right. So for the chair, for example, let's say I wanted to alter this chair top. All right. This is something I also modeled to smooth, and I can see without my projection on here, say I have this back face that looks terrible. Yeah. All right, I'm going to add my turbo smooth, get that in there so I can see what it's going to look like once things are smoothed down. And I'm going to come in and I'm going to add this UV mapper. And now see how that's fixed that face for me? Yeah. And now I don't really particularly like what it's doing here, so maybe I choose my box option, and now I can play with some of the height stuff and change with how, the scaling of my top part of my map. So, yeah. So that's how we're going to manipulate it quickly to get generally what we're wanting. Now, behind the scenes, it's essentially manipulating the UVs for us without us actually having to do the work. That's what's happening.
It seems like it's pretty evident the same texture from the table is on the chair. Is there a way to make that less?
Take it into Photoshop. Yeah, I mean, we could come in here, we could like flip some of this stuff, so, and adjust, maybe we adjust the rotational angle of how the texture's on here, maybe adjust how big it is or how small it is. That's about the amount of control we're going to have in here. We could also go into the shader itself and maybe make some tweaks, but if we do that, we have to have two different shaders so that it's only updating the other one. My recommendation is if you're going to do that, go into Photoshop, adjust whatever saturation levels, adjust the image in Photoshop and then bring it in. That's going to be the easiest way to do that. For this, yeah, they look similar, but so does the reference image, so I'm okay with it. Yeah. But if you wanted them to be distinctly different, yeah, you're going to have to go in and manipulate the image. Or grab two textures here, so I can drag this down and I can say, okay, this is wood 2, and I want wood 2 to be on my top. Wood 1 is here, and now I can go in and let's say, I don't want this to be so bright. Maybe I tinker with some of this ambience a little bit. Oops. Or even go into this image and I can start to toy with some of my options in here. So it just depends. But the easiest solution, yeah, would be the easiest to get what you would want in terms of a look feel would be to take that image into Photoshop, get what you want, and then apply it to a new shader and go from there.
I was just thinking about how much it drives me crazy in games when it's like really clear they use one texture for everything.
Yeah, and that's
and
meant
like,
to cut
ways
down.
to kind of cheat that.
Well, that is the cheat.
Right. Fair enough.
Yeah. So that's what's helping you keep your frame rates up and your latency down and your things running smoothly.
By making those tweaks in the UV map, does that affect things like latency and rendering?
No. Okay. The easy answer is no.
Fair enough.
Okay. With what we're doing, no, it's not going to affect us. Where there gets a little gray area and why I'm kind of hesitant to just say no as a blanket statement is once we get into UV layout, there's going to be things that we'll have to consider where textures are the same. So rather than having the UVs separated in that space, we actually overlap them so they adhere to that same texture. It's little tricks and techniques that we're going to use so that we are affecting performance in good ways.
Right.
Yeah. But for what we're doing right now, no, not really. The nice thing is once we have these UVs set in place here, when we bring them over to Unity, Unity is going to recognize that UV, those UVs where we had them. So we're going to do all this stuff here. When we pull it into Unity, it's going to inherit that information. We're good to go. So we won't have to do a whole lot. Most of our work on the CG side is all done on this side of things. Pulling it into Unity is the easy part. And then the coders go do their thing and pull their hair out. Right? So, yeah. So now, let's say we get this to a point that we're happy with. Maybe we add some extra things. So I'll without doing it or going through and doing it, because I want you guys to get to this point, I'll open up a scene and kind of, or just show you some of the stuff that I did with it. We'll do the scaled one, that's okay. So some of my textures got a little funky. So if my textures aren't coming in, yeah, I'm just gonna relink them. There we go. So I brought my little biped in and I created some walls and so a little baseboard, and then I threw a transparency map in for our rug. So when our rug renders, we won't see the exterior stuff. It's just rather than having to model a rug in, I just threw it in as a texture. And you can actually find this on CG textures. Where did I find that? Sir, I feel like there was a fabric, maybe? Carpets. Alright. So most all of these are going to have transparency map already applied to it. So when you bring that in, I have the color in my diffuse. And then I have it plugged into the opacity channel, and it's reading the transparency map. Okay. And then I just applied some colors to the exterior part of this and scaled it down. So this scene is scaled down to the meters that we did before. Right. And at this point, if I'm ready, then I can start exporting this out to my headset. So no, I would remove the biped. Yeah. So remove the biped out. We're just using him as a reference. Then I can grab everything. I'm going to export, and I'm going to export this out. Let's do export. Export selected. And I'm going to save this as an FBX. That's going to maintain all of my textures and my UV, and if I had animation, it would maintain that information. So I'm going to find FBX right at the top. I'm going to call this table chair environment. I'm going to say this is my export. Actually, no, I'll just leave it at that. Okay. Leave it at the default. Hit OK. Hit OK. Great. Okay. So here's my FBX. I'm going to pull it over. And now when I pull this into Unity, open up Unity.
Is that like a scene? It's like a generic scene file?
What's that? The FBX? Yeah, I mean, we could, if we wanted to, we could export those individual assets. I'm just going to pull it in as a giant scene because it'll separate it out in Unity for me. But it doesn't matter however you want to do it. So let's say, all right, I've got all my stuff done in Max. Now I want to pull it into the headset. I'm going to create a new Unity file for you guys. This would be, your last name, your first name, table, chairs. Great. I'm going to throw it on my desktop. I'm going to create project. Okay. All right. So just like I did in the past examples or in the past projects, let's actually go into Unity. I'm going to create my folders for the things I know I'm going to need. So I know I need a scenes folder. And I know that I'm going to bring in materials. And I know that I'm going to need, I have texture files that are going to be associated with those materials. And I know that I have models that I'm going to bring in.
Why are you calling them models instead of prefabs?
Because I haven't created any prefab yet. These are the things I'm importing in.
Gotcha.
Yep. All right, cool. So once I minimize that down, now I can bring in my FBX. Go back into Unity. Okay, there's my environment. Toss it on in there. I'm going to set it back to the origin. Okay, now right now, my materials didn't come in with it. I mean, the shaders did. What the textures associated with them did not. Now, it gave us this default materials folder, just like we saw when we were importing stuff into our rollerball extended scene, same idea. So I want those to be in their own folder. So I'm going to just move those to the materials folder that I created, and I'm going to delete this one that came in by default. I'm just moving them. Okay, so now what I need to do is I need to go in and I need to pull those texture files in to the materials that were generated. So in my assets, in the textures folder, I'm going to copy over the materials that I was using in my max file. And I don't need all these. I didn't use all these. I'm just going to grab the ones that I did use. So I did that, that. Okay, so my baseboards were just a color. I don't need to do anything there. The blue frame was just a color. I don't need to do anything. I could adjust it if I want to adjust what that blue is looking at. It's pretty dark. If I want to lighten it up, I can come in here and lighten it up. And you're going to see as I'm doing this stuff, my items in my scene are going to update. So my metal, I need, my diffuse is the equivalent to my albedo. So I'm going to find my metal texture. Here's my metal texture. My rug. Pull in the rug texture for that. Now, for this, I also need to adjust. I think I did for this. I think I did cutout. There we go. Yeah. Or even fade would work too. So it's going to start to recognize that alpha channel that I've got in there. So we'll need to adjust that to make sure that it recognizes the alpha channel. Walls were just a color. The wood part of my table and chairs, I know that I need to bring in my wood texture for that. And then I had a hardwood floor. And now I can go in and I can start adjusting my light source if I want to. I could even pull this default light out and put spotlights in or do whatever I want. I can come over and adjust the color, adjust its intensity, adjust how the shadows look. Okay. So at this stage, the only other thing we really need to do to look at this in our VR headset is to turn on VR settings. That's it. So if I go to my file, edit, sorry, thank you. Project settings, player, scroll down. VR supported, make sure the Oculus is selected. Now we can adjust our camera positioning, put our headset on, hit play, and we're standing in front of our table and chairs. All right, so I have one real quick that I adjusted the camera for. So I'll hit play and then you guys can come up and look at it once we have, if you want to look at mine, and then you can do your own.
You put in a camera rig or any of the Steam VR plugin assets?
No. No. Could you, if you guys wanted to do that, could you? Sure.
Oh, I do.
Yeah, knock yourselves out. Yeah, I did not for this. Yeah. Just because I wanted you guys focusing on the modeling part.
I just wasn't sure if it was necessary.
No, not necessary. Yeah, you don't have to.
Yeah, right? That's what I'm saying. That's why I asked.
What's that?
Good to know.
Oh, yeah, you don't have to. Yeah, you really don't have to. We just need to adjust it. Whatever we see in the gameplay view, that's what we're going to see in our headset. Or at least our starting position, right? at a very base level. Now, would we go in and add functionality, add cameras, and do some of the stuff you're talking about for a full experience? Yeah. Yeah. But just to see stuff and test it out, yeah, I don't need to do that. Much like what we did with our extended rollerball. I mean, we basically just tossed our camera in the middle of that scene and hit play. And we're off and going. We're standing there in front of a spacecraft. Okay. Okay. Now, if we were going to do this for HoloLens, same thing. The only thing with this is because we're going to be looking at this as we're going to look at our table asset rather than kind of putting ourselves in this fully immersive room. So what I'm going to actually do for this is I'm going to remove the environment side and I'm going to leave just my table and chairs. Okay. So for this is where the that document I gave you guys week 3 will be really helpful because it talks a little bit about some of the settings that we're going to utilize for the HoloLens. Setting it up, once you have all of the pieces in one location and you know what you need to do, it is actually pretty easy. It's just getting all of that information in one spot. So first thing we can do, and I'll just run through. I'm going to open a separate project. Let's do that. So I've got a project where I've got the VR and the AR in the same deal. Okay. Okay. So here are my table and chairs. So if we're going to go through and we're going to set this up specifically for HoloLens, there are a couple extra things that we have to do with this that's separate or different from setting this up from Oculus. So the very first thing is we have to make some adjustments to our camera. So if we select our camera, for HoloLens applications, the real world needs to appear. So your actual environment needs to appear behind the things that we're projecting into it. And in order to do that, we have to change what our camera is looking at. So under the clear flags, rather than using a skybox, we're going to change that to a solid color. And we're going to adjust our background color to black. So that's the first thing. The next thing we need to do is adjust our clipping plane. It's just going to prevent objects from being rendered too close to our eyes while we're in the headset. So in our clipping plane, we're going to change that to about 8.5. That's the HoloLens recommended clipping plane value. Okay, now, here's the part that gave me a little bit of heartache when I was doing this the first time myself. That you find buried in documentation. There are a couple different ways that we can look at this. So, hey, Anthony, do we have, oh yeah, we do have the HoloLenses out.
Yeah,
okay.
And I actually already configured it.
Good.
So
Perfect. Super nice and easy. Good, good, good. What's that?
I had to do it for the demo work.
Oh, you did? Nice. Okay, perfect. Yes. So, first couple things that we need to do is change some of our quality settings, and it's just so that things are going to function properly in the headset. Because we didn't really optimize this piece of geometry for this, we're going to see a little bit of jittering, and that's okay. Just know that going in. So under the edit settings, under our project settings, and this is all in your documentation. So when you get to this point, just walk through step by step. You don't have to do it right now since some of you might not be to this stage yet. But in our project settings, we're going to change our quality options. And what we're going to be looking specifically at is the Windows Store options. And we're going to adjust this to be the fastest quality setup. Okay. Okay. The other thing we need to do is target Windows 10 SDK. We need to let Unity know that the app we're trying to export is something that's holographic. So we need to do that by enabling their VR support. So just like we did before, we're going to go into our edit project settings and we're going to choose player. But the difference is rather than having this clicked on by default, this downward arrow, we're going to choose on the Windows option. Now down here we have this VR supported. We're going to check that on, and we're going to make sure that this says Windows holographic. That's the one we need to check on. Okay. All right. Now at this point in your documentation, I have you creating a cube and stuff. You don't need to do that because we're looking at the geometry that we've created, a little bit more complex. But we can make some adjustments in terms of where this is sitting relative to the camera. And I went in, since we're not just doing a cube, I went in and toyed with the camera placement a little bit to get it so it wasn't, strange. But it's very close to what I've got in your documentation. So at this point, what we would need to have happen is we would jump into our HoloLens. We would need to go into the holographic remote player, and it's the icon when you guys are looking at this looks like this. We go into there. Now, we don't have a HoloLens connected to it or recognizing it yet. When we go into this, what we're going to get is an icon that looks like this. And it's going to show you what the IP address for the system is that or for your headset, sorry. We need to write that down. Write that down, tuck it away. Because we're going to need that when we do have the headset paired and set up. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into holographic emulation, meaning that whatever we're doing within Unity, we're going to see it function within the headset. We're not actually porting this out to the headset yet. It's kind of like the emulator in a sense. Rather than using Visual Studio, though, we're using Unity as our emulator. Okay, so to access that, we need to go to Window, Holographic Emulation. Now, here's the thing. I'm going to pull this off to the side because I want to show you the the toils, if you will, that I went through with this. Okay. So, in Windows Holographic Emulation, if you get this error, it's saying, hey, you need to enable VR support in the settings and add Windows Holographic to the device. And I'm looking at this. I'm like, okay, here it is. It's checked. Why aren't you working? And buried in documentation, what I discovered was in order to get this to pop up, you also have to make a change in your build settings. So if you go to your build settings, you have to change this to Windows Store and choose Switch Platform.
And if you don't click Switch Platform, you'll still be pulling your hair out.
Pretty much, yeah. This was several hours worth of pain for me because it was documented nowhere logical. I found it buried in a page that wasn't related to anything else I was trying to do. So once you have that, now when we go to Windows, holographic emulation, our options come up, and then we're off and running. So we're going to choose remote to device, and it's going to give us an option here to plug in that IP address that we wrote down when we went into the holographic player or the remote player in the headset. Once we type that in and we hit connect on the headset, then we can hit play in here and we should see our table and chairs being projected through our HoloLens.
Yeah. I would also like to suggest that you wait until connection status says connected because Unity might crash.
Yeah, you want this to turn green and say connected before you hit play. Yeah. So wait for it. Once that hits green, then hit play and you're off and running. So it's actually, once you get past the red tape of knowing what to do, the process of actually doing it is pretty straightforward. But by the end of today, I want you guys taking your table and chairs, and I want you to look at it in a VR environment. I want you to look at it in the Oculus, and I want you to compare and look at it through HoloLens. That makes sense? With textures on. Some kind of texturing. Doesn't have to be perfect. Right? Okay. Is there any question? And then in the document, although I'm not going to do it, I'll have you guys do the holographic emulation through Unity. It'll be really easy and straightforward to do it that way. In the documentation, I also talk about how to port it out to the headset using Visual Studio. That also is pretty straightforward. During that process, that will allow you to use the headsets untethered. So in other words, not connected to your USB, and it'll actually be on the headset. In doing that, that's when you would pair a device. If you're using a device for the first time, that was the other thing that hung me up is, you know, generally when you're working with devices for the first time, it's like you go and pair and then you do your projects and port it out and do all that stuff. HoloLens is a little funky like that. It'll ask you to pair during your compiling out to the headset process. Then you can pair it and put in the code, and then it'll recognize the headset, but you're not going to do it before. That was also some hours of potted plant death at my house. Yeah. So, okay. So what I would like to do for the rest of today, I would like for you guys to be working on your table and chairs. I'm going to stop lecturing. You guys have heard me yap enough over the course of 6 weeks. I want you guys to work on your table and chairs, and I want you to try getting some textures on there. Next step after that, I'm going to be walking around and helping folks. And during that time, I'm also going to be talking to you about what your grade is currently and where I have gaps for you. So over the course of this week, if you have material you need to get into me, this is the time to do it. And then once you have stuff textured, I want you exporting things out and testing them out in the two headsets and the two devices. Okay. Is there any question before I let you loose to divide and conquer and do stuff?
I have a question that might be, well, how can we change the lighting direction in that? Like, if we want, because in this case, the lights.
Yeah, part of the reason is you're using default lighting right now. So if we want to adjust the lights in max, we have to create lights.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, part of the reason I didn't really go into that is because we're utilizing our lighting system in Unity.
Right.
Yeah, and that's going to change as soon as you bring it into Unity. It's going to change based off whatever your lighting scheme is in there. So, but that's why you're seeing what you're seeing. Okay, good question. Yeah.
So with the sort from the side,
Uh-huh.
again, like,
Oh, the projections?
the side,
Yeah. So for, like I said, it's not going to be a perfect system without doing UV layout, but it'll get us a little ways. So if I have my projection on my table here, let's do group. I'm going to ungroup. With this UV mapper, what you're adjusting is the width, the length, width, and height of the projection. So if I have a box map on it, and I go in and I start adjusting length, see how the sides are adjusting? That's how I did that. Yeah. Yep. Cool. All right. Any other questions? So what I'll do, if you guys want to toy with the scene that I have, or you want to do a compare and contrast, I'll throw real quick. Let's do the VR since I've got Oculus set up in here. I think it's ready to go. So if you guys wanted to come up and just get a feel for it. Let's see where I'm at in relationship to. Oh. Where's. Do we have the remote for the headset somewhere?
Oh, for the headset.
Yeah, I just need the remote for it. Yeah, just the little clicker.
Oh, yeah.
Since I'm not necessarily utilizing the sensors.
This is awesome.
What's that?
This one?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, why is that putting me? Oh, I tinkered with that. Like. There we go. Yeah. Okay. So I will have this up here if you guys wanted to come and take a quick peek at it before you got yours rocking to see where what the end result should generally be like. By all means, please come up and explore. And then we can get the HoloLenses rocking at different stations too, so you guys can test those out. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Yeah, I will. Yeah, I will. Yeah, I will. No other questions? All right. Cool. Divide and conquer. Let me know when questions do arise, and like I said, I'll be coming around. Otherwise, we're gonna treat the rest of today as studio time. So take breaks as you need them. If you need to go grab something and stretch your legs, do it. Do it when you need to. Okay.